So I think I mentioned before that being a pastor is a second career to me. Before this, for almost 20 years, I worked at Underwriters Laboratories. They're located down in Northbrook, Illinois. And I commuted down there every day. Almost all of that time I was commuting from Prairie. It's 20 years. And I sat down and I did some calculating this past week, and I figured out that that is something like 300,000 miles of driving. Most of it was on the tollway. And conservatively, that amounts to something around 5,000 hours behind the wheel. And that's a really conservative estimate, because traffic doesn't always flow that well. And sitting behind the wheel on the tollway, where the speed limit sign is more of a joke, you're sitting there in traffic and you're stuck in that same spot that you get stuck in almost every day. You look for ways to pass the time. One of the things I would do is I would look around to see what the other drivers were doing. Mind you, we were stopped at this point. And then the traffic would start up. And as the traffic started up, I would look again, and here, as somebody is driving down the road, they'd be putting on makeup. Looking in the mirror, doing all this stuff. I remember seeing a couple of people that were reading newspapers. These were drivers. They'd be driving and they'd have the newspaper spread on the wheel in front of them. I remember one guy who was brushing his teeth. You see all sorts of things in there. People think the glass is one way. It's not. You can see in. But I really like looking at bumper stickers. Because I have somewhat of a sense of humor, and I like seeing these things. And some of the humor was fresh and funny, and some of it was unintentional. I got behind a car once that had a bumper sticker that said, "Live simply so that others may simply live," which is a really nice sentiment. It would have meant more if it wasn't on the back of a Mercedes-Benz. There was another car. Had a bumper sticker that said, "I'm only speeding because I really have to use the bathroom." I can understand that one. There have been a few occasions. There was another one I particularly remember that said, "My wife says I don't listen," or something. One of my all-time favorites, though, looking back, might have been inspired by this week's gospel lesson. Because it said in big letters, "Jesus is coming." Below that it said, "Everybody look busy." Doesn't that capture the spirit of Luke in this reading? Luke, verses 37 to 38, he says, Jesus says, as Luke reports it, "Blessed are those slaves whom the master finds alert when he comes. Truly I tell you, he will fasten his belt and have them sit down to eat, and he will come and serve them. If he comes in the middle of the night or near dawn and finds them so, blessed are those slaves." Everybody look busy. Now, looking at this week's gospel lesson, you could go a couple of different ways. But for me, that part of it that I just read seems to be the core message of what Jesus was trying to convey to his disciples and what Luke was recording. Because in the verses that come before this, Jesus is promoting charity. and generosity. He says basically, sell your stuff and give to the poor. Store up deeds of love and kindness, because nobody can take those away from you. And he concludes that section of the reading by saying, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Those are great words to remember. If you want treasure that lasts, then treasure the things that really matter. And don't bother holding on to the things of this world. They don't last. But instead, turn to grace and mercy and love for your treasures. And then after that point, Jesus launches into this allegory about slaves or servants, depends on your translation, who are left in charge of their master's house while he's away at a wedding banquet. And to really understand this, it's important to have some context. So I'm going to do that. It's important to realize that in the first century, or first century Palestine at least, most wedding banquets didn't even really start until nightfall. And then they could drag on deep into the night. Banquets would last, until the wine ran out, the DJ was all done. And it wasn't uncommon for attendees of these banquets to come stumbling home very, very late at night or very early in the morning, depending on your point of view. And if one of these well-to-do attendees had a home with servants and a gate, and he should come home in the middle of the night and find that the gate was locked and the servants had gone to sleep, he might not be getting into his house until morning. That's what Jesus is talking about. Most of us don't have servants. Most of us don't have servants who are waiting at home for us to come so they can unlock the door. So what's Jesus talking about? Let's start from the premise that since Jesus is talking to his followers here, let's start from the premise that Jesus is the master of the house. The followers are his servants. So what Jesus is saying in these allegorical terms is that he's going to be leaving at some point. He's going to be leaving this world, and he's going to be leaving his servants, and he's going to be going away. And I think that maybe Jesus couched it in these kind of hard to understand terms because he didn't want to scare the bejeebers out of his friends and followers. He wanted them to know what was coming, but he didn't want to say to them, oh, by the way, I'm going to die. And then I'm going to come back. And then I'm going to leave. But it'll all be okay. So instead, he kind of put it in this little gentler way of looking at it. And then the next part of what he's telling them is that once he's gone, his followers, remember they're the servants, they are going to be the ones responsible for his house, which is this world. The servants, remember, that's us. It was the disciples then, and it's us now. Are responsible for maintaining and sharing and growing the kingdom of heaven. Jesus came here to show us the kingdom of heaven, then he's leaving, and he's saying, you guys are going to be responsible for that. And if we're vigilant in doing so, then when Jesus comes back, it's going to be a triumphal return. You know, he's going to come back. There's going to be high fives all around. He's going to prepare a banquet for us. His people will be waiting for it. That's what he says anyway. So how do we do that? How do we show our responsibility? For the answer to that, we have to reflect back to the beginning of the passage. And we have to realize that as inheritors of God's kingdom, we are already rich beyond measure. And because we are rich, we should share that wealth with the rest of the world. We should be charitable and merciful and full of grace. Because outside the walls of God's kingdom, outside of the boundaries of God's kingdom, there's a world that's hurting. There are people who are suffering, who are in need of justice and mercy that we can help bring. Outside the boundaries of God's kingdom, people are suffering from lack of what they need, what they truly need. And we can help provide. Outside the boundaries of God's kingdom, the world still has a hold on people who have not discovered the truth about God's forgiveness and mercy. But we know that truth, and we can share it. Now, we didn't get to read this verse today. It's a little past where the passage ended. But there is a verse toward the end of that section of Luke where Peter, after listening to this kind of radical message, Peter goes to Jesus and he says, "Hey, Jesus, are you telling this parable to us, or are you telling it to everybody?" That's verse 41. And when Jesus answers, again, he puts it in allegorical terms, but his answer is plain enough. Because he tells Peter that that parable, that message he's giving, is aimed right at his followers. So Peter asks, is this message for us or is it for everybody? Jesus looks at him and says, "Hey, buddy, it's for you. You need to listen." And if it was for Peter and for the disciples, then it's for us. It's for everyone in this world who has already turned to Jesus Christ to mend their lives and lift up their souls. Because there are so many that haven't. That message is for us. And I find the idea that Jesus is speaking to us this way and giving us this responsibility, I find that awesome and terrifying all at the same time. Because, and I hesitate to use this metaphor in a Methodist church, but Jesus is betting the future of a large part of the world on us. That makes me appreciate something I saw in a movie. Can we have the video, please? Is there something?
Whatever life holds in store for me, I will never forget these words. With great power comes great responsibility. This is my gift, my curse. Who am I? I'm Spider-Man.
We are Spider-Man. We have a great gift and a great responsibility. Jesus didn't just make us responsible. He didn't say, you know what, you guys are now going to be responsible for saving the world. See you later, let me know what happens. He gave us the tools. He gave us gifts. He gave us resources. He gave us a constant companionship of the Holy Spirit. He blessed us to act as instruments of God's grace and mercy to his people. And as the recipients of all those things, of all those riches, we are responsible to see that they get used as God intended. And that they are not just put on a shelf for later. For later that may or may not come. And if it seems like we're getting hit over the head a lot with this message lately, right, actually. It seems to be, or it is, what the lectionary is bringing around this year. But do you really think that's just a coincidence? Or maybe are these turbulent times a perfect time for us to be reminded and challenged to fulfill our responsibilities as followers of Christ? Because when hate is a part of the daily landscape, when fear is a part of so many people's lives, and when truth has become flexible, and the pursuit of power has become an end in itself and not just the means to an end, maybe we need to be reminded again. We are God's people. We are agents of God's grace and mercy in this world, and that is a gift and a responsibility. We carry the power and the peace and the promise of God within us. And with great power comes great responsibility. Amen.